I don't know that much about a lot of cults, but this is maybe the most perfect example of how a group of people become a cult and then go too far I've ever seen. And it's also insane and perfectly chronological, which pleases me on so many levels.
Oh, yes.
This is a story of Synanon and its founder, Charles Edwin Diedrich. He was born in Toledo, Ohio on March 22nd, 1913. He lost his dad in a car crash at the age of 4, and you know what that means for a future cult leader. A lifelong quest to be daddy.
Cosmic Daddy.
Cosmic Daddy's here. That's the name of my bowling team. He became an alcoholic in his teens and then went to Notre Dame, where he flunked out after 18 months.
That's good.
Wasn't there 18 in another story?
Amy Semple, her birth was surrounded by the number 18.
After that, he dropped out of Toledo University, becoming a traveling salesman and sales executive for Gulf Oil for 9 years, and was left by his first wife, whose name was Chilnessa, which sounds like a really cool lady.
Relax, Ronica.
She looks like, Sedata Sarah. So she left him for his drinking, which was not very Chilnessa, if I may say, uptight Rekka. It was at this point he decided to make a change and moved to Santa Monica in the 40s, where he became a beach bum and eventually got jobs working for Hughes Tools and making models for Douglas Aircraft. He found himself a second wife named Ruth Alicious, who also left him because of his drinking. Ruth went on to get murdered by her next husband, but I don't know that story.
You could say that he was ruthless.
That's when he realized he needed to make a change again. This is when 3 things happened that was just the change he was looking for. The first was that someone found him drunk on a kitchen floor and told him, "Fatso, if you do not go to Alcoholics Anonymous, you will die." Fatso that he was, he took this rude stranger's advice, and in 1956, at age 43, he went to his first AA meeting in Beverly Hills. He loved it, and he started going to meetings every single day. Second thing that happened was he read Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson after he had a nervous breakdown. So this spoke to him on a really deep level for whatever reason, and it made him want to devote his life to helping other alcoholics. So he started volunteering to do talks for AA around the state.
Man, I wish this story ended there. It'd be so nice.
I know. And he was a great guy.
Yeah,
he's a saint now. He's a Patreon saint. As he put it, "I say this with as much humility as I am capable," which isn't very much, but when I sit down and start to talk, people start gathering. It's inevitable. No matter where I do it, it just happens. I can't stop it.
I'm so humble, but I just want to say that my friends look at me like I'm a symbol.
I'm going to let you finish.
When people look at me, what they see is usually like some kind of like cosmic sense of justice. You know what I mean?
When they see me, they see, wow, now that is a man who knows alcohol. Now, the third thing was an experiment at UCLA with Dr. Keith Dittman that he volunteered for to get some money.
And now he's the Incredible Hulk, and
I know, everything leading up to this is the same story as Captain America. The experiment was to try to cure alcoholics by giving them LSD. He took LSD. He didn't hallucinate or anything, but when he took it, he did have an epiphany.
We're going to wean you off of cigarettes with heroin.
Yeah. You don't need to drink anymore. You have hard drugs. So his epiphany was that good and bad were the same, and also that he was God.
Wow, those are two bad ideas.
That was his epiphany.
That is two really bad ideas
to have. From this newfound outlook and unnecessary ego boost for the... Oh boy, the quotes he has are just wonderful. He decided in 1958 to gather some of his AA students and have private meetings of his own in a storefront next to his apartment in Ocean Park. He used his $33 unemployment check to rent out this storefront. Gross. I had hiccups. You're sneezing. That's gross. So this new group that he formed went by the name the Tender Loving Care Group.
Oh my God. Big Brother and Company.
He let Tender Loving and the Holding Company. He let 15 recovering alcoholics live in this space, and they would shower using a hose he stuck through the window. He'd counsel them using tough love, and he had wonderful sayings like, "Who needs alcohol? Here we can get drunk with ideas."
Oh my God, I would have left right there.
His most famous...
Who needs alcohol? Bye.
Who needs alcohol? Me. That's why I'm here.
That's why I'm here.
His most famous saying, though, was what he would tell new members: "Today is the first day of the rest of your life." That was from him. So their name didn't last long, however, when one of the members slurred the words symposium and seminar, and he ended up saying Synanon, and the new name, that's it. That's what we're going with.
Going with a flub? What are you, Ali Meekley?
His little beachfront practice was the first self-help, no doctor involved rehab, and treatments involved tough love, as I said, and attack therapy. The main method he used was known as the game. So let me tell you how you play the game.
Board game pieces in place.
Yeah, I call thimble. So he would gather 8 to 10 Synanites, as they were called, and put them in a room together and would pose a question to the group, something along the lines of, "Who's the most boring person here?" And from there, anybody could say anything they wanted to anybody else. They could be as mean and as cruel as they wanted, talk dirty and live clean. That was his motto. There were no secrets. The only two rules, there's no such thing as Father Yoda or whatever we said earlier. The only two rules were no violence and no threats of physical violence. Other than that, they were encouraged to take out all their anger and aggression with the objective of getting a reaction out of somebody and tearing each other down to nothing until they were forced to face their own demons and admit what was wrong with them.
Roast battle! That sounds like an emotional dogfight that I would never recover from.
Yeah, well, that was the point. You need to be broken down.
Wow.
And I'm going to start now. Who's the most boring person here? According to Diedrich, there was something wrong with them. He would make it clear to them. To get into Synanon, you had to admit you were an addict, and you were reminded of that every single day. As Diedrich said, crime is stupid, delinquency is stupid, and the use of narcotics is stupid. What Synanon is dealing with is addiction to stupidity. He said one cannot get up until he's knocked down. Once you were knocked down, he could rebuild you with his own ideas. Once hard drug addicts started coming in, which the alcoholics didn't like, so he responded by kicking out all the alcoholics and focusing solely on drug addicts. He'd use the game to attack them for their past mistakes and would tell them they had mommy issues and would try to control who they dated, and that if they gave up on his program, they'd be lost forever and they shouldn't even talk to their families until the treatment was over, which he would call containment.
I see all the ingredients on the table right now.
This is nothing. Some people were critical of this brainwashing, but he responded by saying brainwashing is a very apt term. We get very dirty brains in here. He told his patients not to try to reason of what he told them to do. Just do what he said and act like it was right. Them thinking on their own is what got them here in the first place. He felt that giving a dope addict the freedom to think was like giving a gun to a baby.
I don't want you to be addicted to drugs. I want you to be addicted to me.
Yeah. He used the game to gang up on you and break you down and bend you to his will, and you had to play this game 3 times a week, which wasn't entirely bad because all he was really trying to do was help you kick the habit, and people swore by the game. They really felt like it was helping them come to terms with their troubles, and that the confrontational nature of it helped them find their voice and how to, speak up and fight for yourself. Outside of the game, if you were caught using, you were given a haircut, which means you were publicly shamed in front of all the others and then given an actual haircut, and your head was shaved, and then you had to sit in a trash can, probably with your own hair in it. But again, people were into this. If you had a serious drug addiction, like what else are you going to do?
I mean, you're used to the self-abuse anyways.
Narcotics Anonymous had been around for a few years at this point, but it was kind of disorganized, and then Diedrich steps in promising a revolution in drug treatment. So why not? Anything less than changing the world is Mickey Mouse, he would say.
Speaking of another cult figure.
Don't get caught using in front of Mickey. I would do Mickey voice, but we've been sued for last month's episode. This all wasn't very profitable. The Synanites had to beg for food from catering trucks and prostitutes and relied on donations. But on September 15th, 1958, Diedrich registered them as a non-profit since they were a drug treatment facility. So now they wouldn't have to pay taxes, but that eventually drew attention from the law. And in 1961, Diedrich was sent to jail for a few weeks for zoning violations and operating without a license. But that was the best thing that happened because now the man had gone after the little guy just trying to help drug addicts. So he became a martyr, and now his cause got its moment in the spotlight. So when the powerful people of the world were alerted to the existence of this struggling enterprise, they did whatever they could to help. Big companies donated food, clothes, furniture, whatever they needed. Life magazine did a spread on them. Governor Edmund Brown Sr., Jerry Brown's dad, he passed a bill that made Synanon exempt from health licensing laws so they wouldn't be hassled in the future, and no rules were ever actually set for how they should operate.
Liberals.
Welcome to California. By 1962, they managed to get enough money to move into the old National Guard building in Santa Monica at 1910 Ocean Way, which is right where Inkwell Beach had been just a few years before that. This provided a new headquarters for Diedrich's growing enterprise, which at this point had several hundred patients. And neighbors objected to their moving in there because they were afraid it would bring more drug addicts and homeless people into the area, and they were right. To enter the treatment, it cost $1,000, and you had to quit your drug addiction cold turkey upon entering and share in the chores and labor around the giant new building. Their schedules consisted of 7 6-hour days of motion, which meant work, and then 7 days of growth, which meant you could do whatever you wanted, all the while being constantly subjected to the game. The compound offered classes in art, drama, public speaking, and music to keep the patients occupied, and if you were slacking off on your duties, you were called out on it it by your peers in the game and shamed into keeping up your parts.
You're not growing.
Hey, that's not enough motion.
Why aren't you growthing?
You're motioning during growth period. So there were communal bathrooms, not much privacy at all. Anybody could listen in on any phone calls they wanted that someone was making on special radios. And there was also The Wire. They got it early.
Yeah.
You gotta watch it.
It's the best TV show of all time.
So it was The Wire, which was an in-house radio network that was broadcasting 24/7 on loudspeakers inside the building, preaching the ideas of Diedrich and keeping everybody on the right track. And all of this was a sensation. In 1964, they had 500 residents, and by 1969, they had 1,400. In the 10 years that they had existed, some 6,000 to 10,000 addicts had passed through. The House of Representatives called it the miracle on the beach. Courts would send addicts to go live here for treatment.
Okay.
They also had a lot of support from celebrities. They had guest speakers like Rod Serling, Ray Bradbury, Steve Allen, Charlton Heston, more than your 2 cents, Milton Berle. Leonard Nimoy and Robert Wagner came in to play the game with patience.
Oh my God, imagine being yelled at by Leonard Nimoy.
I thought you were emotionless. Timothy Leary and Cesar Chavez were supporters of it. Philip K. Dick went there to get clean and then based the rehab in Scanner Darkly on them. There was a movie called Synanon in 1965 made by Columbia that had Chuck Connors and Richard Conte in it.
Richard Conte sounds familiar.
The Godfather. He plays the cat that Marlon Brando pets. Diedrich was also known for the great parties he threw there because since he was dealing with dope addicts, a lot of his patients were jazz players.
Okay.
So he always had great music at these parties. There was even a Sound of Synanon album recorded by patients that they released to promote the program, and the Synanon combo played on Steve Allen's Jazz Scene USA. One of these jazz musicians was a Mr. Art Pepper.
Really?
Who came in 1969 to try to get clean and was okay with the strange conditions inside the compound because, as he said, dope fiends and nuts can't stand routine, and when they get bored, they have to do something crazy. So Synanon made the insanity themselves. The people that ran it caused the insanity. But how successful was Diedrich's program in reality? It seemed to be so successful that other places around the country adopted his methods, including the Terminal Island prison. He claimed that recovery rates were between 80 to 100% cured. This wasn't true at all. People would spend an average of about 2 years in Synanon, and then they graduated and were then referred to as the Walking Dead. And that's how it started. And then Rick Grimes came in and cleaned it all up. What a cool guy.
You're a cool guy. My method, I hit him in the head.
Really hard. In reality, almost all of his patients went back to using after they left the Synanon compound. So in 1968, Diedrich saw an obvious solution to this. Nobody graduates anymore. You don't leave.
Oh, okay.
You see the progression.
Yeah.
Like, year by year, it gets more and more into a cult.
And it's so slow to
Exactly.
follow the logic
Exactly.
that it would slip into being a cult
If
without
you're
you
into it,
seeing
you don't even realize.
until you are so far into it, like, oh, now I can't leave because I shaved my head.
So when you joined Synanon, you were now in it for life, and together you would build a new drug-free utopia with Diedrich as your leader. Around this time, Diedrich wanted more money brought into the enterprise. He wouldn't accept government grants because then they'd have to be evaluated for how successful his treatments were, and the results would not be good. So he decided to open up the doors to people who weren't addicted to anything and simply wanted to join just because they liked the lifestyle. Synanon had become very popular with young people as a way to examine your life and come to terms with who you were.
Okay.
This allowed for more residents, which meant more money coming in. These people who weren't addicted, they were referred to as squares, and they had to give all their possessions to Synanon when they joined. They also started doing lifestylers, who were squares that were allowed to be a part of Synanon, but lived and worked outside and had to give all the money they made to Synanon. But that didn't last long because most of them ended up not being, you can't have it both ways, so they would just sort of leave, and they became known as splittees. Since these new squares might be harder to control than a recovering drug addict, Diedrich came up with a new, even more extreme version of the game that appealed to the drug culture at the time and promised to open up your mind without acid. This was called the Trip. So it would start on a Friday with a group of like 50 new Synanites who were led through candle-lit, incense-filled hallways through their compound to a big room lined with army cots. So each person had a cot and a set of white robes for them to wear, and their watches were taken from them so they wouldn't know how much time had passed. But they were so excited to be part of Synanon, they didn't care. And then the game would begin, and their guides would kill all of their enthusiasm and yell at all of them and turn them against each other until they were all depressed and ashamed of who they were. These guides had done research on each of the people in the group to get personal information, and then used that to bring up every bad thing they had ever done and everything they felt was wrong with themselves. They knew how to get to you. Diedrichs sometimes told them, maybe one day we will just put dingbats like you against the wall and wash them off and bring them back into the human race.
And he's the guy
And people
to do
liked
it.
this. The new recruits were deprived of sleep and were subjected to the witching hour, which
Is that what we're going through right now?
This is hour 48 of this recording. I can't let Greg leave until he breaks. So the witching hour, they had two witches dressed in black and white robes using a Ouija board that would spell out Emerson quotes from Self-Reliance and would tell them that they had to accept Synanon or they'd go to the fifth circle of hell.
Wow. Which one's the fifth circle?
It's for vegetarians. Some people started hallucinating. They were told they were there because they were resistors to the Synanon truth and were yelled at until they would break down and cry and then turn on the other recruits who hadn't broken down and yell at them until they did. Once everyone was beaten into a bloody mental pulp, they were rebuilt with the Synanon ideals. Then come Monday morning, they were marched out of that room to band music into a ballroom filled with a cheering crowd of their new Synanite brethren where everybody did a special dance called the Hoopala.
Yep.
You're a Synanite now.
You just do a mashed potato time
Yeah.
and you're a Synanon?
Hey, I know I told you that you're a disappointment to your dad, but how'd you like to do the Watusi with me? But with all these new non-addicts coming in, it made the real addicts uncomfortable, just like their arrival had made the alcoholics uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And just like happened to them, they were slowly edged out until Synanon became more a way of life than an addiction recovery program. And by 1972, there were 1,700 of them, and this became a period of huge growth. Starting in the mid-60s, they started operating Synanon businesses run by the Synanites. They would run gas stations, manage apartment buildings, and auto repair business. They sold pottery, pens, shirts, wallets. They were all branded with Synanon. They became the second largest firm in the United States, and in 1968, they were taking in about $1.2 million a year. By 1976, it was $8.7 million and was either getting donations from or doing business with over 20,000 businesses and organizations. 1 out of every 5 company on the Fortune 500 list was involved with Synanon.
God, that's crazy.
Yeah. By the end, they were worth close to $50 million and had opened a private corporation in Lake Havasu. Essentially, they laundered all their money there. That wasn't to mention that they were still getting new members who had to pay monthly dues of $450 for an individual, $750 for a couple, and $440 for a child. With all this new money, Diedrichs started buying up property. He opened up chapters in Oakland, Detroit, Germany, and Malaysia.
Wow.
The city of San Francisco donated an entire block-long building to them. Then he started to build an entire Synanon city of 3,300 acres in Tamales Bay, becoming the largest private property owner in Marin County. Then he bought over 2,000 acres in Badger, where he built Synanon buildings, a trash dump, and an airstrip.
This is like so big.
Also, he built a luxury home for himself called the Home Place, where he eventually moved.
You run out of weird name.
It's called the Goobly Blop.
I'm waiting for one of my followers to say something wrong. I'm going to name my place that.
Drink all this and then try to say my house. Mickey Mouse. So he eventually moved there so he didn't have to be around ex-dope fiends, as he put it.
Oh, boy.
But with all this income and lavish spending, the IRS started to get suspicious of whether
fiends.
or whether or not this was actually a non-profit organization, which it wasn't, and there was talk of revoking their tax-exempt status. So in 1974, Diedrich came up with the perfect solution. Synanon was no longer a drug treatment center. It was now the Church of Synanon. And a memo among the Synanites asked, who will be God? I'll give you 1,700 guesses. This is when all bets were off. The charade was over. No more pretending. Synanon was a cult and subject to the impulses of their new god, Diedrich. When Diedrich had to go on a diet, all the followers had to go on a diet. When he had to start running in place to lose weight, everyone had to run in place to lose weight.
You don't want enablers.
He took up whittling, so did everyone else. When he quit smoking, nobody else was allowed to smoke. That did not go over well. 150 people were kicked out for not quitting, and if you were kicked out of Synanon, you were not welcome back. If you left or were kicked out, you were never spoken of again. He decided all women had to have 4 earrings and all men had to have 1. In the mid-70s, he decided that all men and women had to shave their heads, so they did. This happened to be just the look George Lucas was looking for when he was making THX 1138, so most of the extras in that movies were members of Synanon.
Wow, really?
He did glut raids, where he would randomly enter people's rooms and take away excessive personal possessions. He experimented with the 24-hour day, where half the people worked during the day and half the people worked during the night. Whatever idea came into his head, he'd try it out. They referred to their little terms and phrases as Synonese, and he lobbied to have a Synanon embassy in Washington, D.C. as part of his plan to form a separate country of Synanon. One thing Diedrich was big on was racial integration, and to set an example to the rest of his followers, he married an African-American former heroin addict and ex-prostitute named Betty, and he encouraged all his followers to find partners outside of their own races. You did, however, have to get permission from an elder to date somebody. He and Betty would sit in thrones wearing robes, but in 1977...
So humble.
In 1977, Betty died of lung cancer, so he announced that he was accepting applications for a new wife.
Oh my God.
6 people applied, but losing Betty had been so painful to him that he decided nobody should have to feel that pain. So he declared that every couple living there had to break up and get together with new Synanon-picked love matches, and every 3 years you had to break up again and get rematched with someone in mass weddings so you couldn't get too attached.
It's like speed dating, but really sad.
But longer.
But longer and really sad.
But you can't have an ever-rotating cast of spouses without having some kids along the way. Children born in Synanon were dealt with in typical cult fashion. When a woman was 7 months pregnant, she had to move into a separate area called the hatchery and had to stay there until the baby was 6 months old, so as to remove the father from some unpleasant aspects like getting up for the 2 o'clock feeding.
I don't get a dad, so neither should you.
Just keep rotating. Everybody's dad, nobody's dad.
My dad's he's rotating.
He'll be back soon.
He'll be back soon.
After this, the kids were taken from their mothers and raised communally and could only be seen by their parents once a week, and mothers who wanted to see their kids more were referred to as head suckers. The children alternated between 3 weeks of school and then 3 weeks of apprenticeship in specific trades. When these kids were put to national achievement tests, they actually scored above average.
Wow.
So hey, it's working.
Let's do that more often.
However, in 1972, Diedrich decided none of the children should live in the Santa Monica compound and that they should all be kept in the Marin County compound. So this prompted some 200 to 300 people to leave Synanon in protest to separate it from their kids. But the kids that remained were sent up there and were made to start playing the game at age 4.
Oh man.
Imagine yelling at a 4. You're boring!
I feel like most interactions with children are like the game anyways.
Yeah. Naturals. Kids ran away all the time to neighbors, but the local sheriff, Dave Mitchell, had been elected with Synanon's support, so the reports of child abuse were ignored and the kids were returned to Synanon to continue to be abused. In 1977, Diedrich got tired of having kids around and decided they were a waste of money, so he decided no more children will be born in Cinnabon. He said of childbirth, I understand it's more like crapping a football than anything else. And
can argue with a man that's smart and humble.
He said that nothing is sacred just because it's been done for 1,000,000 years. And not just not having kids, all men were required to get vasectomies, and the 4 women who were pregnant when he decided this were forced to get abortions. So this prompted even more people to leave the church. Diedrich, however, never got a vasectomy. He said, I am not bound by the rules. I make them. When some people started wondering when they could graduate from Synanon, he said nobody graduates from a religion. He knew how people saw him and he responded, I am considered a megalomaniac nut. Of course, this is true, but I'm not so crazy. But aside from harsh words and the forced birth control, Synanon was still a harmless organization bound by the rules of no violence or threats of violence.
Okay.
Until 1973.
Oh my. You know the Manson family who did that thing about 5 years ago? I got an idea.
They were playing the game and Diedrich was talking and a woman kept interrupting him and he got so annoyed with her that he dumped a can of root beer on her head.
Aww.
And this was a direct violation of the no violence rule. Everybody was shocked and he immediately apologized, but then just as quickly he said, I'm not sorry. And he justified himself saying, I gave the woman a lesson in manners. And that was the beginning of the culture of violence inside of Synanon. Pretty soon, courts started sending juvenile criminals to Synanon as a sort of scared straight sort of thing.
Yeah.
But these punk squads, as they were referred to, wouldn't bend to the verbal abuses of the game, so they started to physically beat the kids to straighten them out. It sounds horrible, but this is a method of dealing with juvenile delinquents that many other institutions started to adopt also, and I think probably still use. Then the violence started being used on people within the organization that they suspected of stealing or of being spies or just general enemies of Synanon.
Right.
People who they kicked out of the church were sometimes thrown thrown out of windows and sometimes thrown off of roofs. Diedrichs was done messing around and he started seeing his church as the future of society. He said, this is the kind of revolution that moved the world from Judaism to Catholicism to Protestantism to Synanism, to Cinnabon.
Cinnabonism.
He was ready to launch what he referred to as a holy war.
Oh, no.
And to launch a war, he needed an army.
What? But where would I find? Oh.
He started training some of his followers in the Depot Flats in the Badger Mountains near his home compound. They were trained in a made-up form of martial arts that he called Sindo, and in case that failed, he bought them $200,000 worth of guns and ammunition from a single gun store. He also got cars, trucks, hundreds of motorcycles, 21 boats, and 10 airplanes.
But first rely on Sindo.
Try the judo topping. It's delicious. On your Cinnabon. This army was called the Imperial Marines, and they were led by a man named Dr. Douglas Robson. The Marines patrolled their compounds in Santa Monica. It was believed that trespassers on their property were taken into the basement and beaten under Dr. Robson's commands, most of whom were just dumb teenagers.
Yeah.
They also went after ex-members and enemies.
Oh my God, they went after ex-members?
Yeah, one such enemy was a guy who cut off Dr. Robson driving down the road up in Badger. Later on the day, while playing the game, Diedrichs shamed Robson for not attacking the guy who had disrespected him. So Robson took a troop of Marines, tracked down the car that had cut him off, went to the guy's house, held his family at gunpoint, and then pistol whipped him while his family watched.
Wow.
Also up in Badger, a neighbor named Alvin Gambonini was helping smuggle out kids who wanted to run away from Synanon. Once they found out about this, they sent the Marines after him, and they beat him up in front of his family. On March 20th, 1978, a former Synanite named Tom Cardino was on his honeymoon and took his wife to that Synanon area to show him where he used to live. When they saw that he was there, they tied him up to a post and beat him in front of his new wife. On September 21st, 1978, another ex-member named Phil Ritter tried to go back and get his kids out of the church. They clubbed him over the head and put him into a coma for a week. Another former member named Jack Hurst had spoken out publicly against Synanon, only to come home one day to find his dog hanged in front of his house. Another young woman named Rosalina Cole disappeared from one of their compounds and has still never been found. In all, they attacked about 40 people all over the country in these karams, which is what they would call missions. And if one of the soldiers were caught during one of them, they were trained to go to jail and say nothing ever of their involvement with Synanon. The other group of people they went after were their critics in the media. In the 70s, Synanon was getting a lot of bad press. An LA Times reporter named Narda Zucchino went after them pretty hard. Connie Chung was on the news denouncing them. Unfortunately, Synanon had an in-house legal team made up of 48 members, and they managed to win a lawsuit in 1972 against the San Francisco Examiner for defamation and won $2.6 million. One newspaper that escaped their wrath was the Point Reyes Light, which was a weekly paper in Marin County that had 1,700 subscribers. They reported constantly on how bad Synanon was, but since they were so small, they didn't pay any attention to them. Who did pay attention to them was the Pulitzer Prize Committee, who gave them the Pulitzer for Public Service in 1979 for their coverage of the story. Then Synanon made a misstep and sued ABC and Time magazine. This gave journalists access to the Synanon records, and the documents of their violence were now out in the open. When NBC did an expose on them in 1978, the station received hundreds of letters from Synanites threatening them with physical harm. A representative from Synanon then went on CBS News and said while the cameras were rolling that bombs would go off in the homes of their critics. Then some of the members bought stock in ABC just so they could go to a stockholders meeting where they then identified themselves as former members of Murder Incorporated and asked the ABC board if they had protection for their wives. But the biggest bee in their bonnet was an LA lawyer named Paul Morantz. His attention was first brought to Synanon because a woman who was having a pre-psychotic break checked herself into Synanon, and then when her husband found out where she was, he went to get her out, but they said that they had already sent her to their facility in Tomales Bay and that he couldn't have her. Nobody was helping this man get his wife back, so Morantz stepped in. In 1977, he alerted the health department that Synanon was treating people without having any license to be able to do so, but like I said, Synanon was pretty much immune to minor problems like that. In March 1978, Moran released a report on the atrocities that Synanon was committing, but the authorities ignored it, and the Synanon lawyers silenced him for libel. But that didn't stop him. In the summer of 1978, he lobbied at the request of Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein against a bill proposed by a California congressman named Herschel Rosenthal, who was a Synanon supporter, to protect Synanon even more from health licensing laws. Morantz's effort got the bill defeated by one vote.
Wow.
In June 1978, a woman in Synanon died and her husband ran away to escape, but their 3 kids were left behind. So the grandma enlisted Marantz, who was able to get a court order to get these 3 kids out of there. Synanon refused to turn over the kids, and the building had to be surrounded by police with guns before they finally gave them up.
Could have been Waco so easily.
Yep. He also managed to win a $300,000 judgment against them, and Diedrich had enough with Marantz. That was the last straw. While Marantz was launching investigations against the church, Diedrich would take to the wire radio station they had and would demonize Marantz. He talked about him so much that when people managed to get out of Synanon, they'd often go to him because they knew an enemy of their enemy was their ally.
Yeah.
So he got even more stories about the abuse that was going on there. Then, by carelessness of one of the investigators, in October 1978, Marantz's address was put on a memo that was given to the Synanon legal department.
Yeah.
They immediately gave that information to Diedrich, who then read it over the wire and asked who among them would have the guts to do something about it.
No.
So he wanted Marantz dead, but he didn't want to pay a hitman to do it when he felt confident enough in his Imperial Marines.
Yeah.
So Marantz got tipped off by one of his contacts that they had his address, so he went straight to LAPD to beg for protection from Synanon. While he was gone, 3 Marines went to his house in the Pacific Palisades and put a 4-foot-long de-rattled rattlesnake into his mailbox.
Oh my
So when he got home, he checked his mail and saw what he thought was a package in the mailbox. He reached in, snake bit him. He survived, but he was in the hospital for 11 days. The Marines had also left a Synanon business card at Marantz's mom's neighbor's house to let him know that they knew where his mom also lived. And thus was born the Hollywood trope of death by poisonous animal. It was beyond obvious who did this to Marantz, but there was no proof. Now, remember how they had tried to set up an embassy in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah.
Shortly after the Marantz thing, their fake embassy started using their intimidation tactics in Washington, D.C., which does not fly there, and the local media started investigating them pretty hard. This led to Diedrich attacking one of the reporters and then fleeing to Italy to avoid assault charges. However, he didn't leave for long because he wanted his deposit back on the building in D.C., so they wouldn't give it to him, so he sued them, which for legal reasons I won't even pretend to understand, allowed the courts in D.C. to get access to the Wire radio network, which kept recordings of everything that was ever said on it.
Yeah.
So the tapes the authorities were given were heavily edited, but it was still enough. They were recordings of the threats of violence. There were recordings of people being beaten that they had played as a warning to others. They also found the recordings of what Diedrich had said about Marantz leading up to the snake attack, which was, "Don't mess with Synanon. You can get killed dead, physically dead. I am quite willing to break some lawyer's legs and next break his wife's legs and threaten to cut their child's arm off. Try me. This is only a sample, you son of a bitch. I really do want an ear and a glass of alcohol on my desk."
Oh, okay.
So Jonestown had just happened a few days before they heard all this.
Yeah.
So the authorities realized that
yeah.
this isn't happening again.
Yeah.
So police were sent out to search the various compounds, and an arrest warrant was out for Diedrich and the guys who had placed the snake. They finally found Diedrich in a house in Lake Havasu on December 2nd, and he was drunk, which is weird for a recovered alcoholic who started a cult to reform addicts. It turns out he had started drinking again after Betty died, and he even allowed the other Synanites to drink as well. The guys who had planted the snake were sent to jail. One of them was the son of band leader Stan Kenton, but Diedrich just got 5 years of probation and a $5,000 fine. However, he was forced to step down as chairman of Synanon and could no longer be involved with the church and religion that he had created. On top of that, Synanon was essentially categorized as a terrorist organization, which made future cases easier to win, of which there were several. The church tried to get back to its original nonviolent roots after Diedrich left, but they were still making huge profits, which was something brought to the public's knowledge by Forbes magazine, and that led to the big companies that supported them like IBM and Heinz to sever ties, and that's when the money problems hit. Then the IRS came asking for the taxes that they owed them from having an illegitimate tax-exempt status, and in May 1982, they finally lost that status thanks to the same judge from the Watergate case.
Wow.
And the money started bleeding out until 1991, then when they finally ran out of funds and Synanon was closed for good. Their Santa Monica compound turned into the Casa del Mar Hotel, and in 1997, Charles Diedrich died in Visalia, and if it turns out he was right all along and he was God, then I'll finally have the last laugh for that vasectomy I gave myself while I was researching this story.